Okay, so I hope you would like what you see. I know this topic is a very hot topic. There's a lot of concerns from different sides, different parties. For example, freelancers and clients themselves, in terms of how to really actually go through the whole freelancing process. And I know there's a lot of hassle throughout this journey, since a lot of issues might arise, and a lot of issues usually end up arising from with both sides. So hopefully we'll be able to tackle as much points as possible and as relevant to your side. And that's why I've made sure to kind of focus a bit on the sections themselves, and keep a bigger margin for the Q&A session, so that you can actually benefit from there, and feel free to ask anything as well. You're also encouraged to open your video camera if you want. Feel free to do so. And yeah, I'm gonna start by basically introducing myself. So I basically started programming at the age of 8. I'm self-taught. It was actually by mistake. I found the logo for Fox Pro. I thought it was a game, and then I figured out it's a programming software. Funny story. Anyway, so ever since I've been just passionate about learning, I've ended up learning around 26 languages and other frameworks as well. I've done Cisco certificates, networking, security, programming as well, even minor in mathematics. I really wanted to understand what's happening in the background. And then when I realized that a lot of issues are happening in the freelancing industry, I decided to approach that. And I co-founded, that's when in 2018, I co-founded Imperium Code with the main goal of solving this issue and eventually reaching another level in the industry, and setting kind of a process to make sure no issues happen throughout the whole project life cycle, or at least if any, they would be kind of easily addressable, you know. So I'll just give you a small briefing regarding our session today. So first, we'll go through the main issues in freelancing, like just in as general as possible, and we'll try to go specifics as well. Then we will talk about managing expectations, and it's not only managing clients' expectations; it's managing expectations in general, because clients as well as developers need to know what to expect throughout the project, what are their goals, responsibilities, etc., for everything to really work out. And then the most kind of apparent and obvious issue is time and product management. Then we're going to go through some, like, not really whole case studies, but like some quick scenarios that usually happen throughout the project, and discuss what can be done throughout those scenarios. And then finally, we'll reach the QA session where you'll be free to like ask me anything you have in your mind. I will launch as well a small poll, just a quick one, just 2 quick questions, and feel free to like answer it at convenience. So let's start. And basically, let's start by stating the obvious. During the whole freelancing lifecycle, the customer starts by explaining what they really want. And unfortunately, the project leader doesn't always understand it fully. So in this picture, you can see what the client actually explained and what the project leader actually understood. But then the analysts, in this case, they will design it differently, and the program obviously will understand something else, you know. So it's kind of funny how it happens. So it's kind of a broken cycle that between every step and another, there's something that's being miscommunicated or assumed. Now, at the end, this is what the testers would receive, and unfortunately, this is what the business consultant will describe to the client. The documentation is always left at the end, so the project ends up with little to no documentation. What the operations actually installed or like deployed in the case of a software, the DevOps, they don't always deploy the whole code correctly, or like sometimes not all of the code is ready. So we end up with a broken cycle. The customer finds himself or herself paying for a project that is worth much less than what they actually paid for. So they're basically being overcharged. And then, unfortunately, as well, in some cases or most cases, the developers don't have time to keep on maintaining the project, and the product maintenance becomes very expensive. So they end up taking other projects, and this is basically how the project is maintained. So the marketing team advertises something entirely different, but the last picture is actually what really matters the most, because the last picture describes what the client really needed. And if you can compare all of the pictures, you would notice that what the client needed looks like nothing of the above. And they didn't even need the wooden chair. They just needed something to sit on and be able to balance themselves. So it's really not, it's not only important to understand what the client wants, it's also more important to understand what the client really needs. And then we're going to address the rest of the issues of how to translate these issues and these concerns and this vision into actual practice without having to go through all of this cycle. So how to start a project? That's the first question someone might ask. Well, to me, alignment is key. And that's why you always need to make sure that you're aligned with the other party, whether it's whether it's on how to work, when to be able to call each other, how to contact each other, the method of communication itself. Is it only by email? Is it phone calls? Are phone calls welcome or not? Are weekends considered as working days or not? Like even the most obvious questions that usually you don't dare to ask, it's important to ask these questions. Because if you're not aligned and if someone thinks that things need to be done in a certain way and the other thinks that things should happen in another way, conflict will arise. And this is why alignment is key. Also, during a project and when starting a project, it's very important not to oversell yourself or the project itself. So in a lot of cases, the clients end up saying, yes, I am building the $1 million project, and that's why you have to give me a discount, and we will work together on a long-term basis, and I have investors waiting, etc. So this is overselling the project at some cases. And this will create disappointment because in case the developers will end up finishing the project, they will not see any results, and they will see that they've made discounts and sacrifices for nothing, and eventually they will lose the motivation and the pace for the maintenance, etc. Same thing for the developers. When they oversell themselves, the client will expect a lot and then will start thinking that, yeah, I can build anything, the developer can do anything. So they start over requesting and dreaming and trying to do something that doesn't even exist in the market, while they are confident that the developers can actually deliver. And it's also wrong. So it's very important not to oversell oneself. Okay. Now, please let me know if I'm going too fast, too slow. I can just adjust my pace accordingly. So upon starting the project, really the first thing is translating what the client says into technical states, into technical words. But we already spoke about that. It's not, the client doesn't always know what they want. They think they know what they want because they don't know what the actual, they might not always know what the actual potential is and what's out there in the market. And sometimes they even think that they're the only ones doing a similar platform while other platforms already exists that does that achieves similar goals. So we really have to, again, focus about what the client really needs. And why the reason I'm emphasizing on that point is that you cannot figure out what the client really needs by just asking them what they need. You cannot figure this out in one session or even two. This is a long process that needs to have its own timeline and its own milestones and its own investment even from both sides, because it will literally define how everything will continue from there on. Unfortunately, a lot of developers and clients tend to think that they're aligned and everything is fine, and then they jump into the project, everyone's excited, and then they end up with disappointment. And it's as simple as just giving this step an importance, and the problems will be minimized drastically. And as simple as it might seem, practically speaking, it's very hard to achieve this, because you have to really have patience and be aligned with the client to also have patience before starting. So okay, you align with the client, you want to start the project, you want to start drawing the roadmap, and the first question that arises is, okay, we need to estimate the project's cost and the timeline itself. And basically, you know how to climb the mountain, so you know how to write code, you know how to design an architecture. That's not the problem. The problem is that you don't have a map, you've never been there, and there is basically no guide, because most of the projects that are being built so far, they are done in a startup mindset. There's a lot of innovations. Most of the people are trying to build something that didn't really exist before. And even the idea itself might not be viable or not, but it simply didn't exist before. So there's no guidebook of telling you what to do and what not to do. It's not like 15 years ago, people used to know, okay, there's an accounting system, there's this application, they go by the book, they follow the legal instructions that are set by the government or whatever it is, and then there you go. But now the ideas are more innovative. They're trying to solve more specific issues that maybe not everyone is facing. So you need to find the right audience and get the right answers from the right people, etc. So yeah, so it's very important before starting the journey to actually understand where you're going. And this cannot happen all at once. It has to be done in little steps. So the trick is to simply take very little steps and keep exploring, while being always transparent. At any point in time, if you find that, okay, we started the exploration phase, I started understanding what the client really wants, then I might also understand that, okay, I might not be able to deliver the project because at the beginning I thought, for example, the client wants ABC, and turns out the client needs something else that's out of my league or outside my technical knowledge, etc. So it's very important to stay transparent at all times. Same thing with the client. If they figured out that what they're asking for eventually is way outside of budget, they should be able to tell simply if the developers or freelancers that, okay, this might go out of budget and we might not have the budget for it at once. So let's do it in smaller phases. Otherwise, the developer will think that, okay, he or she has secured a project for a certain period and a certain amount, which is not the case. So that's before you start and like for kicking off the project. But also after you start, it's really important to make sure that all parties really understand the phase you're in. Which means if you're in the discovery phase, obviously no code will be generated as a result. And if you're throughout the development phase, obviously testing cannot happen right away. It only happens during the testing phase. But this is the easy part. It gets complex after you start testing certain components, and then you move on to other components in the development, and then testing to other components. And then suddenly you realize that the client was giving you feedback on an earlier component that you provided earlier and that they had the chance to test earlier. And this is where it gets messy. So for example, if you develop the login page and then the main page to list the main let's say the main users, of a platform. And then after defining that page and testing that page, you go ahead to testing the profile page, and then suddenly you start getting feedback on the page before. And then the feedback on the page before might affect the profile as well and the whole timeline of the project. So it's very important to make sure that, okay, in which phase are we now of the project? What are we really expecting feedback on, and when is it even over? So until when do we keep expecting feedback on? You cannot expect feedback on the login page at the end of the project, and then you change everything from there on. So that's very, very important. Now, do not be afraid to invest time. This has, I think, become obvious by now. The more you explore, the less surprises you'll get. The main thing about software development is that most of it is abstract, and it's inside the machine, and you can see it on the screen. I'm talking about the software itself. So it's not really something that's tangible. And that's why many people or many clients tend to think that, okay, it's easy to change, so it's flexible. Since it's not tangible, then it's flexible, but it's really not the case. You can actually compare it directly to engineering. And when you want to build a certain building, for example, or a house or a train station or whatever, you cannot proceed with the construction without defining the blueprint. And it's obvious when it comes to train stations and buildings and houses, and no one even dares to go to a construction worker and telling them, okay, let's start with the house, without having the blueprint between their hands. So they take some time, they go to the architect, they go to the engineers, they draw the blueprints, they make sure everything is clear to the letter, and then they start building. But yet in software development, this is not taken seriously because of the misconception that software is flexible and everything can be changed. And it's not true. The software has different layers. There's the database structure, there's the API model, there's the API structure itself, there's how the components are talking with each other, different pages are communicating with each other. So it's much complex than what the clients really think. And if the developer doesn't make that extremely clear to the client, the clients won't care. They just want to reach a deadline given a certain with certain features and a certain budget, and that's not their fault. It's the responsibility of the developer to emphasize on the importance of this phase and on investing time, because if you do the structure in the wrong way, the foundation in the wrong way, then obviously you cannot scale. And if you want to later on change something, you might have to delete most of the code or like revamp the project or whatever it is. Okay, moving on. So that's why it's also very important to manage expectations, and it's kind of part of the alignment, but also it's not enough to align at the start. If you already told the client or the developer what to expect in the start, it's not enough, because throughout the projects many things change and many things can happen. So it's very important that throughout the project everyone always knows what's happening, what's being developed, where are there any dependencies that are causing any issues, etc. So transparency, again, it's key. It's very, very important to communicate throughout the project. The developers usually think, yeah, it's not the problem's fault, or it's not the it's not the client's fault, or their concern to know the details. Yeah, it's true. They should not maybe care about all the details, but some details are important for the client to know, because it's also their business that's at stake. So it's important to be transparent with them, and when you're facing any uncertainty, to actually state the uncertainty and to state how you're going around it, or at least provide some assurance or some warning that, yeah, there might be a bumpy ride at a specific phase or during a certain period. And that's why it's also important to understand when to say no. And it's not when to say no to a project, it's also when to say no for a certain feedback or a change request, because throughout the development life cycle, and as you're building the project, sometimes the clients suddenly realize something from the market and they would like to add a certain feature, for example. And if you keep saying yes, you're basically trying to please the client and making them happy and proving that you're a good developer. But at the end of the day, this might cause a delay on the project. And then at the end of the day, if this delay wasn't communicated clearly and the client wasn't really made aware of that, you're going to end up with a conflict, and the client might have other commitments that are also dependent on the release of the project, for example, marketing or whatever it is, and they will have damages. And regardless of how much features you've added to the client to make them happy, they will end up feeling annoyed and let down. So it's important to say no, not only just to say no, it's important to say no for the sake of the project. Of course, when there's something that's that sometimes you feel and you are certain that might not really make a difference, and you're confident enough that it can be done, why not? But also, it's a risk that the client should be made aware of. Also, it's not even if a feature makes sense, it doesn't mean that it should be done for free. Some features, they require a lot of work and can only be visible after reaching a certain level or like a stage in the path. So it's not fair for the developer to be working for free as well. So it's important to know when to say no, when not to say no, when to accept a change, when not, and how to actually go around this from the beginning. And again, it's all about managing expectations. You can agree with the client from the beginning that no changes will be accepted, or you can agree with the client that changes will be accepted, but every time there's a change, the budget will change and the timing will change, or other terms. It doesn't really matter what the terms are. What really matters is that you make sure you can deliver and commit to them, as well as the client, him or herself. Okay, so moving on. Now, time and project management. And this is basically not attainable in any way, shape, or form if we do not actually abide with the steps that I stated earlier. If the requirements are not defined, if the blueprint is not well drawn, if the details are not well set, even the boarding details, for example, what color the page would be, what's the font size that's going to be used. These are very, very little details that you think, yeah, it's easy, I can change the font in 1 minute. But eventually, if you don't really define these stuff right away, and you're going to end up most of the project just changing fonts and changing colors, which is going to be frustrating for both entities. So time and project management is not feasible if what the client expects and the end result is not really clarified. It's not really clear. It's not really certain and explicit for both parties. So as long as once we jump to this topic, we assume that the actual requirement is well defined. So during this phase, it's important to identify and manage and minimize any dependencies. So dependencies are not only between features or components themselves. Dependencies are also between the developers and the client. For example, sometimes you want to integrate a new payment gateway. So in order to integrate the new payment gateway, you've read the documentation, you know how to do it, you've done it a million times, but you need to add it to the project, and you've estimated, let's say, 6 days for it. But if you don't have the API keys for the gateway or the account details, or like at least the staging APIs from the client, you won't be able to actually start or test your work. So if you're not aligned with the client, and if you don't have these details before you start the project, or before at least a certain date before starting this specific task, then you're going to end up losing a fair amount from these 6 days, sometimes even more than 6 days, to even get to only get the API keys in order to just start the work. And this will also cause a delay on the project, even if it's not your fault entirely, and if it's the fault of the payment gateway provider or the client failing to really give you the API keys quickly, or not knowing maybe how to even provide them, the damage has been done. So when you identify these dependencies and you make sure to handle them before you start, or you make sure that the client is 100% aware that at this date, if they're not available, like these details are not available, then a delay will happen in the project. It's an inevitable thing, and there's nothing you can do to avoid this. You have to address it from day one. Same thing for anything else, as simple as a Facebook login integration, Google integration, whatever it is. And the same goes for the developers themselves between different components and let's say APIs. So the front ender will always need something from the back ender. And the main trick here, in order to minimize dependencies between the front ender and the back ender, is to define the API interface before even starting. So even if it goes down to just defining a mock API, just a mock structure that doesn't really access the database or anything, just produces a static JSON structure, it's enough to kind of untangle the dependency that happens between the front ender and the back ender. And it can be, we've actually done projects where we define the APIs at the beginning. The front ender works on their own pace. The back ender does a different sprint on their own pace. And then at the end of the project, it's as simple as switching from the mock APIs to the real APIs, and everything works seamlessly. And this can be done. It's not something that's really hard. As long as everything is well defined, this can really be done easily, and you can gain a lot of time during the project and minimize a lot of issues. So other than minimizing and identifying dependencies themselves, it's important to define the main milestones. So when to expect to release what, and usually the milestones are really related to the dependencies as well, because each milestone needs a set of features to be done in order to be closed, etc. So defining the main milestones, the release date of those milestones, the testing date of those milestones, and most importantly is to define the limit for the testing period. You cannot expect the testing period to take 30 days and the project development is like 3 months. You need to say, okay, during development, I'm gonna develop this feature in 20 days, and then I expect the client to test for like 10 days. During those, we will have a lot of feedback, and then after that we'll fix, and then there's another testing period for X days, and then this phase and milestone should be done. And this is very, very important to be defined, and for the client and developer to be aligned on, and not to leave testing till the end of this period. It's important to start testing as soon as possible, even if it's testing small components, because the faster the developer gets, the sooner the developers get feedback, the faster they can solve it and integrate it in the milestone itself and release faster. And it's very, very important to really develop a contingency plan. It's a must. You cannot assume that the project is going to be a success from day one and that everything will just work out the way you want. Everything, we're living in this world, and there's a lot of things that are happening, and now there's COVID, and who knows what's next. It's very important to always keep a contingency plan in place to make sure that you do not gamble with the client's destiny. Some people or some clients are actually leaving everything and just focusing on their project. So you cannot just assume it's going to work and then put them at risk. And this means that you really should not be optimistic. And that's a lesson that I myself had to learn at early stages, because you would always want to be optimistic and always want to assume the best, but it's not always the case. A lot of cases, a lot of things happen, and if you're optimistic, you won't be able to develop the contingency plan even in a realistic model, a realistic way. Now, so I've kind of spoke a lot. I mentioned the main issues and like kind of what I had in mind and the main guidelines. Now I'm gonna just go through some small scenarios that usually happen. So requirements, for example, always change. Developers got sick, clients desired timeline suddenly changed, developers got stuck, bugs are never ending, and then client or dev is no longer reachable. And some of these issues I've actually took from the comments on the thread so that I can address them. And I'll start with the requirements are always changing. And I think we spoke briefly about that when I said that you should know when to say and when to say no. And basically, if you kind of reflect on what we went through, what we've gone through so far during the presentation, you would notice that as long as you have aligned with the client from the start on how things are going to be done, then you would not even reach this case by design. So by design, there won't be a scenario where the client would be always changing the requirements, because you would actually have it set from the start that, yeah, these are the requirements, so they will not change. So there's no risk. Even if you have to develop, take some time to develop the whole functional requirements, wireframes, UI, UX, interactive designs, 2 recorded sessions to make sure everything's clear. It's important to do that because it's really, it's all of the hassle that you do at the beginning will save you much more at the end. That's why most of the projects, they take like 6-month development and then a year or so fixing bugs and changing stuff. However, if you invest 3 months, then okay, you're gonna get 3 months research and then 6-month development and probably 1 month fixing bugs, not certainly not a year. So when you see it that way, you're gonna see that, okay, investing 3 months without typing any line of code is actually worth it, because it will save me all of the trouble and the conflicts that will arise after the project, and it will avoid the whole demotivation, etc., toxic cycle. So when developers got sick, I've actually started the poll and I asked what to be done, and I'm looking at the answers, and so most of the answers actually, most of the people actually answered wait for the developer to actually get better. And yeah, that's actually a very nice answer, because you're actually considerate to the developer, but it's not always the best way to go, because sometimes you won't know how much it will last, and you cannot just be waiting indefinitely, and then it will cause like a also toxic relationship. So what's kind of better is to also ask for, yeah, now the answers are kind of changing. So some people actually answered, ask the developer if anything needs to be done. So the developer themselves are the most people who are aware of, okay, what's actually the risk here. If they got sick for 2-3 days, sometimes they've already accounted for them in for those days in their contingency plan. Then they would tell the client, yeah, no problem, these were already accounted for, so the project is not at risk. But here's a point that requires transparency, which we mentioned earlier. If the developer in this case is not transparent enough to be honest and to say, yes, the project is at risk, or no, the project is not at risk, then the client might have false feedback, and this in turn might cause further issues and even more dissatisfaction and bigger conflicts. So it's very important at this stage for transparency to happen and for trust to be there, and for the developer to be comfortable enough to to tell the client, oh, yes, I will need help. I will need someone else to take over until I'm better, or like I might not get better, etc., etc. So for the and now this actually raises another question that was brought up. What if the developer got sick and yeah, they told us we need someone else to come in place, but then at the end of the day, the code was not really documented enough, and that's really the developer's responsibility to develop their code in a way that it would pass the bus test, what we call the bus test. It says uh, if so the bus test is a test that says if you were developing something and you were hit by a bus today, can someone else look at your code, understand what's happening, and continue from there? And the code should always be built at that mindset. It should be always built in the mindset that the developer, so you are not always in control, you are not always able to predict everything. So make it so that at any point in time, anyone who looks at your code can actually understand and continue. And you don't have to worry about being irreplaceable or like replaceable in that sense, because it does kind of raise that issue for some, but really it's not the case, because as long as you're transparent, you're delivering, the code is clean, etc. It's even if you're replaceable, the client won't want to replace you. So that's my advice for that. Now, in case the client's desired timeline suddenly changed because of some investor requirement or market need, etc., it's important for this to be communicated transparently and directly to the developers, and for the plan to be in place to prioritize which features needs to be done first. And the client needs to understand in this case that not all of the features will still be done during the new timeline, and will have to make some compromises in that specific scenario, of course. And in some cases where there are contingency plans, the client might be lucky enough that the contingency plan itself might account for that, so there won't be an issue eventually. Now, when the developers are getting stuck on a bug that's never ending, it's not wrong to ask for help. It's not wrong to tell the client eventually that, yes, we are stuck. There's an issue here we're not being able to solve. We require a consultancy, for example, if you're not being able to like get another consultancy yourself. And it's not wrong to go on a forum and ask. And yes, it is wrong to just jump on Stack Overflow, get the first answer and try it out, because you'll be trying endlessly and hoping for something to work and losing more time. So communication, again, is key at this case. And at least, if not with the client, at least try to find a good mentor or consultant to help you out. And if you feel that there's a 1% risk that, yeah, the client might get hurt, it's better to notify them sooner rather than later. At least they would be involved as well with you. They will try to give you their opinion. They might even change the feature to make it easier to be implemented. You don't know how helpful the clients can be when they really understand what you're going through. So don't be afraid to speak up. So what happens when the client or dev is no longer reachable? And this is a big issue, because sometimes the developers suddenly disappear, or the client suddenly disappear, not intentionally, without intentions, for because of sickness or something. There should be a point of contact set in place, and that's recommended as a backup point of contact. So, for example, like an emergency contact, if I went offline, someone else, a partner or another stakeholder, a project manager, should be available to take over, who also knows about the project and what's happening. Same for the client. If the client had to go offline, they should have at least a secretary, an assistant, another project manager that can take over and make the decisions. Because if the testing feedback didn't go through, then yeah, we won't really, the developers won't be able to really take it to the next step. And I think I kind of took more time than expected on the slides. So I'll just jump and wrap up here. We spoke in general about freelancing, managing expectations, time management, and kind of what to do when something goes wrong. There's a lot to discuss more, but I prefer to jump on the Q&A and check your questions. I've also included some videos, some YouTube references for you to watch. They are just nice talks that kind of address a similar topic more in depth. So feel free to do so at your convenience. And yeah, so basically I'll check the Q&A box, and if you don't mind, use the Q&A feature, not the chat feature, because sometimes the chat feature ends up having us lose some questions. Yeah. I'll start answering meanwhile the questions. Yeah, okay, so there's, how do you get projects? Okay, that's an interesting one, because getting projects can be from, like, let's say using LinkedIn, using projects like Upwork, wherever. So online platform. It can be as simple as so how do you get projects? This can be done either through platforms like LinkedIn, Upwork, similar even Codementor. There's a lot of freelance projects there, but this is not the only way. A word of mouth and reputation itself is a very, very important way to get projects. So for example, don't hesitate to, I'm gonna tell you in brief about myself. I've basically done 6 years of work for free for different projects. I'm not telling you to do the same, but I've done that to get experience and to be able to actually for my reputation. So you can start by, for example, lowering your rate on Codementor or like Upwork or whatever platform is out there. And by, instead of starting by $10 per hour, you can start by $2 per hour. And then after getting enough reviews, you can make your rate higher because you would have built credibility. And eventually, after you do projects with clients and they end up being happy, they will themselves end up referring you to other people because they like your work, they trust you, and other people around them might have similar issues that they will gladly recommend you to solve. So yeah, this is kind of the main approaches that really work really well. So another question is, what can you do when expectations weren't managed from the beginning? Well, when expectations weren't managed from the beginning, you have to just talk to the client or like to the developers and state the issue. State it obviously that, yeah, I now realize that we haven't managed our expectations, and due to that, I've been facing facing recently a lot of issues related to ABC, and I suggest to either stop the project, it might be as drastic as that, or continue working together, but on better terms, and let's highlight these issues. And for me to be able to continue working in a healthy environment and be able to maintain your project, etc., these issues need to be addressed. And then you start brainstorming with solutions. And basically that's it. You have to take a drastic stop and address the issues. Okay, so is it normal to, so another question, is it normal to get afraid each time taking a project that it might be out of your league? Yes, of course, it is normal, but it's also something that's important, that not to always take the project, because sometimes if it's really, really out of your league, you have to at least let the client know that, okay, I'm not really sure about this project. I haven't worked with this technology. I'll be exploring. I can lower a bit my rate since I'll be exploring, but so some issues might arise that I might not be able to predict. If the client is okay with that and they're willing to take the risk, why not? But they need to really, really be able to understand that risk that they're taking. It shouldn't be like any risk. But the main recommendation I have is do not learn on on the account or on the expenses of the client, because the clients will hurt a lot if you end up doing the wrong learning curve or understanding something in a different way than it really is. But it's also important not to be afraid from learning new technologies. And sometimes it's better to just tell the client, okay, let me do some research, make sure that I can actually do this. You can go on, you can go and ask for a mentor, get some consultancy to make sure you're getting you've divided the task correctly and the structure correctly. And then, yeah, you can just end up, you would have better confidence doing the project at the end. Okay, so many questions. Guys, I'm actually, everyone, I'm looking at the Q&A box to answer questions. I'm not looking at the chat. So if I haven't answered your question yet, it's probably because you're not using the Q&A feature. So how do you think about Web3 projects like NFT Marketplace and DeFi? Well, I think they're very interesting. They're very nice. And it's definitely a new technology, so everyone's curious about it. But it's also important to have the client understand what's the paradigm they're going into, because sometimes they end up putting their money and not getting the right ROI they expect. So if you know, since you know better as a programmer, for example, you should be able to tell the client, okay, no, careful, this idea might be risky, etc., and make sure that they're putting their money in the right place. And I do see a future for them in general, but it depends on a case-by-case purpose. A lot of projects out there do not make sense, and others do. So I cannot really build a solid opinion yet on it. So if you're a junior developer, should you start front-end projects or back-end projects? Well, I advise to start front-end because they're kind of easiest to start seeing quick results. On the backend, you develop the APIs, but if no one uses your APIs, you won't feel that they're that important or if they actually make a difference. But again, if you don't like to play around a lot with CSS and the designs and you feel bored with that, then you can just put it aside, start with Python or something that involves algorithms, and then play around with that, get to know the backend structure first more, find a front-end developer or someone who's trying to learn front-end, and then build them an API to actually get a real use case. You don't want to be doing things randomly. Okay. So when negotiating for free, what percentage that's ideally to ask for upfront? I'm not sure so the percentage to ask for upfront is depending on the actual operations, in my opinion. So for example, for you to be able to perform the project, you would need X amount of money, which is, let's say, 20% in order to reach the first milestone. Then you should ask for 20%. Let's say if the first milestone is in 2 months, but if, let's say, the milestone is in 6 months, and 20% of the project is not enough for you to sustain financially, then this is an operational issue. You have to state it and just ask for maybe 50% or 40%, or maybe even break down the milestone into smaller phases and in a way that's affordable, you know? So I'll start answering questions that are in the chat, Mani. So one is how to increase the learning curve. And basically you increase the learning curve by increasing either in the same project, you would start suggesting more features that the client might like, and you would offer a discount in order to do it, and everyone would be happy. Or simply put more challenges on yourself on the side. When you have free time, just do the extra mile, effort. For example, one way for me was whenever I finished a project in Ionic or, let's say, Objective-C, I would try building the same project in Java, Kotlin, and then I would compare that to Swift, and then rebuild it again in let's say C, whatever, to really find what's really the so yeah, to really eventually learn the most about the language. And it really depends on what you're trying to learn, if it's more features or like building more components, or if it's learning more languages. Let's see if there's any more questions. Negotiating for a fee, that's one share. So the Q&A, it's not a link, it's a button that you should be able to find. But feel free to ask Max. I just heard your question. And then what if the client suddenly became aggressive and started to argue about your work and put you down every day and tried a lot to absorb his attitude, but he keeps doing that? Well, in this case, you just dismiss the client, and then you would try to end the project in the most a peaceful way, let's say. Or I don't recommend lawsuits, but at the end of the day, if the client has taken something that was your right, then it's your right to simply claim it, and possibly in some cases you would pursue with a lawsuit. But this should be like the last resort. But in my opinion, it might be as simple as calling things even and maybe reimbursing the client with some amount, because shutting down such clients is and might be much better than keeping working with them, because keeping working with them, like if you keep working with them, it would be much more toxic, and with the same time that you're spending with them, you can actually get better clients, have a healthier relationship with your clients, and possibly even earning much more money. And even if you're earning less money, but at least your health is not being damaged, which is the main important thing. Okay, so as a beginner developer, how do you know if you're ready to take on projects? That's the thing. You never know. You always think that you need to learn more. And you only know when you just start asking for people that, okay, I'm a developer, I'm available if you want to do a certain website or something, and looking around and seeing the need in the market. And then once you spot something that you believe you can do, you just jump on it, and you, again, be very transparent that you're a junior developer who's learning. So there would be a learning curve. But as long as that happens, then yeah, you really don't have an issue, because everyone has to eventually start somewhere, and money is not the really main important thing. Knowledge is, experience is, and then your rate can really go up exponentially even with time, because the need for developers is only increasing. So it's important to keep learning, but also it's important to keep scouting the market for what the market really needs and what they're really asking for. And whenever you find something that you can take or do, then go for it. Okay, so building a portfolio of projects in GitHub. What kind of projects could highlight the talent in your opinion? Sometimes I spend more time submitting small problems when I do spike test for new programming languages, for example. Well, that's interesting actually, but in my opinion, it's more, the portfolio is on GitHub is more attractive when I see consistency. So for example, when I see that a person has been working on, even if it's one project for a certain period, and has been being consistent, like pushing 3 times per week at certain hours or like certain days, and always keeping the project maintained and growing the project, fixing features, adding features. This by itself is more important than having like 10 projects and none of them actually can run because they were written a long time ago, and or like having 10 projects and having like 3-5 months difference between one project and another. It means that, yeah, it's not really the consistency is key basically in everything, and it shows a lot about the character of the developer. And also the type of projects are like, it's interesting to see what the developer has in mind. So whatever challenges the developers is facing or like trying to solve in the industry, the more creative the products are, the more attractive the portfolio gets. So don't be afraid to build really complex projects that you believe would take time if they interest you. The main key here is that you make sure that they really interest you. Otherwise, you won't have the strength or motivation to pursue that to the end. Yeah. So I'm not sure if I answered all of your questions. I'm a full-time, yeah. So let's see. I'm a full-time developer. I think I cannot take much more time during the session to respect everyone's time, but I'll just answer this one more question. So I'm a full-time developer interested in eventually going freelancing. Any suggestions on what kind of things, skills I should focus on to help me in this transition? Well, mainly you don't need to be a full stack developer in order to jump on freelancing, but you do need to find a good partner or a good freelancer to be able to freelance with. Otherwise, you would need to become a full stack developer, but this is something I do not recommend as well. So I don't recommend just for the sake of it. Like if you like front end, you shouldn't just learn back end just to be able to get projects and then end up doing the back end in a wrong structure. So yeah, sorry, there was some noise. So yeah, it's as simple as finding the right person to work with, or simply stating to the client that you're a front-end developer, you don't do back-end. The client themselves, him or herself, will end up finding another back-end developer. And this is where it's important to, again, define the APIs and the structure and what both parties need from each other so that you don't have a conflict with the other developer. It's important as well to kind of not be afraid from jumping on the freelance market, although it might seem more uncertain. However, with some investment from your side and some time, it can be much more rewarding, but it depends. Each person can have their own preference. Some prefer freelancing, other not. Okay, I think I've answered everything. I'm not sure if I missed any question, but at least I've covered everything in Q&A. It was great having you. I hope you really enjoyed this. I'm not sure how much insights you got about it, but if you want, leave in the comments thread even later if you want to suggest or like, I would gladly be happy to host another event to address any other issues that you might have or questions more specifically. So yeah, regarding the recording, it will be actually, yeah, so regarding the recording, it will be actually provided after a week, around a week from the state, and it will be shared on the channel of on the channel of Codementor themselves. So you can watch it on YouTube. Also, I'll share it on our page and Imperium Code on YouTube. Feel free to contact me on my email address, george@imperiumcode.com, and you can check out our LinkedIn as well. It was great having you, and yeah, for the links in the presentation, they would be in the presentation itself. So I think that would be also provided in the description. So there's no worries there. Okay, have a great night and afternoon or morning, wherever you are. It was a pleasure having you.